The Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Pride Seeds, High Stick NT, and Cruiser Max Vibrance Beans.
Bern Tobin here for Real Agriculture, joined today by Rob Miller from BASF. We are at the Maryhill Research Farm, just here in southwestern Ontario. And Rob, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's been a dry year. And a lot of people ask questions about residuals in a dry year and whether they're as effective in these conditions. Yep. You've been hearing those questions, so what do you tell people?
Yep, so we've been getting a lot of those questions lately, especially this year, and we're still seeing the value of that residual weed control with your burn down, especially in terms of soybeans. You know, in a dry year, you don't get as much, it's not as effective, but you're still looking at 80% weed control, and I'll show you in some of the plots later what we mean by 80% weed control. One of the things you have to consider in a dry year is coming in a little bit earlier than planned to do that in-crop herbicide application. Some of the weeds that might escape, you know, might get a little bit too large if you do wait too long. The thing is, this year, any weeds that germinated from some type of depth. So they were germinating from 2 to 3 inches down. So they were going to be very difficult to control to begin with.
So Rob, we always hear about activity and activation of herbicides and whether you need a rain to activate herbicides. How does that work? I mean, is this a year where we didn't see activation, or is that herbicide still there waiting to work?
Well, I guess it depends on the herbicide and the amount of rainfall. Some herbicides can activate on less rainfall. Some herbicides require a lot more rainfall for activation. When you think about the herbicides that require less activation, you're looking at minimum 1/4 inch, but in general, 1/2 inch is better. Yeah. There's some, and that's at one shot, not, you know, 2 tenths here, 2 tenths here, you know, 2 weeks from now, 2 tenths. It's one shot, one herbicide up, at least 1/4 inch, but 1/2 inch, you get much more consistent weed control. There's also some other herbicides that require more rainfall. So you're looking at 3/4 of an inch for activation to provide consistent weed control. Right. So it depends on the environmental conditions, depends on the soil type, depends on the amount of activation and the amount of rainfall that requires activation and the herbicide.
Right. Now, you've got a bunch of plots here where you've got different residuals working in different combinations. Let's take a look through them, walk through them, and see what we can learn about what's happening with residual this year.
Yep, definitely. So in all our research trials at the Maryhill Research Farm, we always keep an untreated check. And here behind me is the untreated check, and you can see that we do have a large amount of Candida fleabane. We don't know if it's glyphosate resistant yet, we're still doing the testing. Large dandelions, ragweed, some lamb's quarters, and others, those tough to control weeds like bindweed. As we move to the next plot here, the one beside me here is glyphosate alone, and this was applied at about 4 weeks ago. You can see, you know, there's no residual activity with glyphosate, provide the burn down, but we're starting to see those secondary flushes. Even in a dry year, we're still seeing those flushing weeds come up. We're not expecting any residual activity, but a grower would have to come in and do their in-crop application probably about 10 days ago to clean up any of these emerged weeds. So the next plot I'm standing in is glyphosate plus Optil Emerge. Optil is a residual product, has both 2 modes of action, the Kicksort technology, as well as Pursuit to provide that early season residual weed control. At the Maryhill site, we've had about 1/2 inch of rain over the last 6 weeks, so we have been very dry. But as you look at this plot, that even in a dry year, we're still seeing over 80% control and 80% residual control of some of these flushing weeds versus just the straight glyphosate alone. The value of that early season residual weed control is that you get more uniform emergence, so it's easier to plan your in-crop application of a herbicide. The critical weed-free period is also between the 1st and the 3rd trifoliate, and some reports are talking about even at the time of emergence all the way up to the 4th trifoliate. So we're roughly in the middle of that stage now where it's critical to protect these soybeans in order to keep them weed-free and maximize your yield potential. And also, using a residual herbicide will decrease the selection pressure of those glyphosate-resistant weeds. So it's also an excellent weed management strategy. So the next plot I'm standing here is more of an IP-based soybean herbicide. This is Frontier plus Conquest, and you can actually see that it is pretty clean, especially in a dry year. We're getting additional above 80% weed control. Even in a dry year, you get those multiple modes of effective action. Some of the different herbicides require less or more activation, so it actually weatherproofs your system. There are the odd weed that you might have to come and clean up here, but we still are in that critical weed-free period that we're maximizing that yield potential, maximizing the beans. Even in a dry year, we're still seeing that value, taking out the lamb's quarters, the pig weeds, as well as the fleabane with the 2 modes of action on the fleabane. So even in a dry year, we're still seeing that value. Yes, you might have to adapt your management practice. You might have to come in, spray those weeds a little bit earlier than what you've planned, but that herbicide will still remain on the soil surface. So when the rains do come to activate it, it'll wipe out any of those later flushing weeds and maximize your yield potential.